In the midst of economic upheaval and at the tail end of the Black Death, as England became consumed in one of the largest popular uprisings in history, and as workers marched on the Tower of London, the firebrand preacher John Ball made the following pronouncement. He said, "If everyone is descended from one father and one mother, Adam and Eve, how can the Lord say or prove that they are more lords than we, save that they make us dig and till the ground so that they can squander what we produce?" We need to talk about radical Christianity. Welcome to Champagne Anarchism. Welcome back. Today we are digging more into Murray Bookchin's The Ecology of Freedom, this fantastic book. Today our video will cover chapters 7 and 8 in this book. So if you want to catch up on any of the past videos, all of those are out on YouTube, and definitely check out the Patreon. That's patreon.com/champagneanarchism. The chapters we're talking about today are The Legacy of Freedom and From Saints to Sellers, so 7 and 8. And today we're going back to the concept of freedom, and especially we're going to talk about the concept of freedom in the context of kind of early Christianity, these early Christian movements. Because the thing about early Christianity, and especially this particular period that we're talking about, is that it was incredibly radical. But first, let me say, please like, subscribe, all that good stuff. We talk about radical books on this channel, and I have the 100 Great Anarchist Thinkers project going on Patreon. A couple of those videos will hit YouTube, but most of those will be up behind the paywall on Patreon, and we'll be talking about sort of the 100 by categories, greatest thinkers. The Lao-Tzu episode is up. The Zhuangzi episode will be up by the time this video is up, so please go check that out. There's a lot of cool stuff that's going to be hitting over there, so definitely check it out if you have time. Let me know what you think. As always, I'm really enjoying a lot of the comments that people are giving. They're sparking my own ideas. There's a lot of stuff that I have not considered as I go through these books, because we are necessarily covering a lot of ground in these videos. So if there are things that I miss, and there will be things that I miss, I really appreciate when people kind of give me a nudge in the right direction, which I think makes for really awesome videos at the end of the day. So thank you all for doing that. If you are already a subscriber to the Patreon, thank you so much. I love you very much. Your support really means the world. It helps me continue to make these videos and make them freely available, all this main feed stuff, to anybody who wants. So I really appreciate you being there and all of your support. But let's get into it. This video today is going to have 5 sections. I'm going to first give a little bit of an introduction just to kind of organize our thoughts as we go into this, because a lot of leftists, I think, have a very clear way that we tend to think about religion, and I think it can often be very unhelpful. So I'll just give a little bit of a kind of a, just a bit of a nudge, maybe, let's call it. And then part 2, we will talk about the apocalypse and Christian eschatology. We will get into that really intense word. We will also talk about the Demiurge and the rise of the Gnostics. Then we'll talk about the Black Retribution, this idea that Bookchin has about the hallucinogenic strategy. It's really interesting. And then finally, we will talk about the modern church. Let's dig in. Now, by way of introduction, I am not religious. If you want my kind of personal opinion on this stuff, I used to be an avowed atheist, and now I consider myself much more agnostic. Over the last several years, I've become much more comfortable with that. I am just increasingly more comfortable in kind of luxuriating in the deep uncertainty of the universe. I will not rule out that there is potentially a higher power, but if there is some kind of higher order in the universe, I very much doubt that we could describe it in any meaningful way as humans, and I very much doubt that we could write it down in a book. That just seems a little suspect to me. However, all of that being said, we do need to make a distinction here between religion and faith. When it comes to religion, Marx has a very famous maxim about this. He declares it to be the opiate of the masses, and I think that's broadly right. What he means by that, actually there are a couple ways to read that, but baseline meaning is that religion at its most basic level, by offering a world beyond ours, beyond the one that we can see and feel, but something kind of beyond, it pacifies. It says, put your head down, be good, and you will be rewarded. And that's a bit of a dangerous idea. It keeps you quiet. It keeps you in your place. It's what Bookchin would refer to in these chapters especially as quietistic. It keeps you kind of pacified. This is one of the things that Marx wants to get across when he gives us that line about religion being the opiate of the masses. Religion is often a method of control. In fact, most often, it is a method of control. There's typically one person at the top, most likely a man, who claims special knowledge or access to something divine, and everyone else below them is a follower. At its core, it tends to be very, very hierarchical, and Bookchin does make that point in this very book that we're talking about right now. Faith, however, is a little bit different. If we're talking about religion, yes, it can be broadly hierarchical. Faith, though, something kind of radically different, because faith is saying that I, kind of independent of anyone, have made the decision to structure my experiences and my worldview and my life in this way. That's completely distinct. Because, unfortunately, there is no one meaning of life. And to me, just from where I'm sitting, if you would like to live your life believing that your loved ones will enter the kingdom of heaven, or if you want to live your life according to karmic balance because you believe that you will be reincarnated someday, or maybe you think that Cthulhu is out there and exists and must therefore be exalted, I don't actually really care. I think all of these are kind of totally fine. As long as your personal beliefs don't really encroach on those around you, as long as you don't make your beliefs their problem, there's an inherent mystery to the universe, and we're just kind of all trying to make sense of the world out there. And so individual and independent faiths, I don't really have a problem with. And I say all of this because when it comes to things like Christian radicalism, there are a lot of leftists out there who have, I think, extremely patronizing attitudes towards people of faith, and I have absolutely no time for that. Religion, religious institutions, religious leaders, all of this is fair game. These are absolutely structures of power just like any other, and they deserve to be questioned. Occasionally, faith groups will function in radical ways and have non-hierarchical structures, and I do have friends that tell me about these particular faith groups that are very helpful to them, and that is just awesome. But when all is said and done, when it comes to the fundamental question of the nature of existence, my personal rule is kind of just be cool. Like, truly, just be cool, man. That's my spiel. Now let's talk about the apocalypse. Or maybe more accurately, let's talk about Christian eschatology, which is less cool sounding, but maybe a little bit more accurate. Eschatology is the bit of theology that's concerned with the end of the world or the final judgment. It's something you find in many religions, but Christian eschatology in particular, we're talking about things like the final judgment, about death and heaven and hell and the last battle and the defeat of Satan. These are deeply, deeply influential in a lot of the thought that underpins what you might call Western civilization. That's a bit of a tough thing to classify what exactly that is, but let's go with that phrase for now. This is kind of underpinning a lot of Western civilizational thought in ways that we might not even necessarily immediately recognize. Because we are talking about freedom in this chapter, Bookchin tells us that in classical times, the focus was on justice and not on freedom. We talked a little bit about this last time. So freedom to the ancient Greeks is very utopian. It's something that is deeply unrealistic. When the early Christians roll around, however, freedom's back. Freedom's back on the menu, and it's back for a very specific reason. Bookchin goes into the thought of a thinker, a philosopher, a theologian called Saint Augustine, or Augustine of Hippo. Saint Augustine, by far, one of the most influential Christian theologians and thinkers and philosophers out there in the history of time. Rome is falling at the point at which St. Augustine is writing, and a lot of Romans are blaming the influence of Christianity for the fall of Rome. St. Augustine goes out and he writes kind of his masterpiece, his magnum opus, if you will, is this book called The City of God. Now, The City of God is Augustine trying to grapple with the fall of Rome, but also he's writing for Christians and he's trying to reassure Christianity about the fall of Rome. And that's a very important thing to realize. Like, this is where Augustine is coming from here. And Augustine's take on this is very interesting and very, very profoundly influential. What Augustine argues in The City of God is even if the empire falls, even if there is no more Rome tomorrow, it actually doesn't matter, because what matters in the end is the triumph of the city of God. Christian eschatology, especially when you look at somebody like Saint Augustine, it comes with this very revolutionary idea, which is that not only is utopia possible, but also it's inevitable. And this is very important, utopia is inevitable and it will happen on earth. And more than that, the city of God that St. Augustine describes that will come to earth, this is the kind of the utopia that will happen after the final judgment. The city of God is in conflict with the city of man, which is something that he only refers to a couple times in The City of God, the book. However, it is kind of nonetheless the way that we interpret this text now. But what does all of that mean, especially for our earthly empires? If you are running Rome, or what's to come, the kings, the feudal lords, the capitalists, the presidents, all of these people that are to come, what does it mean to them? Well, it actually means that they're illegitimate and they don't matter. So when we are pursuing the heavenly city, the new Jerusalem that St. Augustine lays out, Augustine says focus on that. Don't focus on what's going on here, because what matters is what's going to happen in the end. Bookchin also takes a bit of a departure in chapter 7 when he talks about the Garden of Eden. This is a really interesting idea, and it's a very powerful idea because the Garden of Eden isn't heavenly. It's not from beyond. It's not supernatural. It's actually on earth. The Garden of Eden happened. Bookchin says it's located not just in time, but in place, and that really, really matters. And it matters first because it limits the draw of the supernatural, right? Where we are worried about about heaven and hell and everything beyond this earth, but we are also very much concerned with our earth, because if utopia has happened in the past and will happen in the future, guess what you have to worry about? Stuff happening here. And this also gives rise to a few strains of Christianity that are also kind of looking at nature as something that is bountiful and connected with the Garden of Eden idea. We shouldn't, I think, over-romanticize this. A couple people have made the point that Bookchin maybe kind of presents these early Christians in a light that is a little bit too favorable. He may over-romanticize some things, and this is one of those places where he might. But Bookchin, in this section, he references the myth or the story or the legend of Cokaygne. Cokaygne is a land, sort of a legendary mythical land, which is said to be a paradise on earth, where nature is not scarce, but it is abundant. And from this, Bookchin presents us with an idea of freedom that's a little bit new. This is a freedom of abundance. This is a consumerist idea of freedom. It's just freedom as unfettered consumption. Whatever you want, you can have it. And he opposes this, so he opposed to this idea, and also emerging around the same time is a productivist concept of freedom, which is, nature is opposed to human goals. Freedom is all about allocating the results of our production. Just kind of keep these in the back of your mind as we go through the rest of this. But to come back to this idea of Christian theology, Bookchin says that this idea of apocalypse and the battle at the end of the world and the city of God proved tremendously influential. And it's one of the reasons that a lot of early Christians were so radical, because, kind of think about this for a sec. If utopia is coming and it's opposed to the people running things right now, awesome. Let's get rid of the people running things. And you may say, wait, hang on, Justin, one sec, because it's easy to conceive of a version of this that's actually the complete opposite, right? If heaven on earth is inevitable, if it's just going to come no matter what, why not just kind of kick back? You can chill. It's coming. And Bookchin says, actually, it's significant that all of this is framed in terms of a battle. If you have this in your mind as a battle that is fought between good and evil, the battle against Satan for the end of the world and for paradise and utopia that's going to come, the city of God, then actually you need to fight for this vision of the future. This is why Bookchin says that this kind of Christian eschatology is earthbound and future-focused. These are two terms that he uses that are very very, very significant. While all of this is happening, the church is kind of drifting, sort of the main Orthodox version of the church, and defining what that is almost impossible, but the main Orthodox version or versions of the church tend to drift towards power and also conformity with power. We actually saw this back in chapter 6. I didn't put it in that video because I figured I'd reference it now, but Bookchin says that you can see indications of this, the render unto Caesar kind of idea. You play ball with power. This is kind of the main line of the church. So you have early Christian movements kind of coming to this communalist idea through the work of Saint Augustine. But you have the main center of the church, the kind of gravitational center of Christianity, coming closer and closer to power. And Bookchin says that this is what's happening right up until the Gnostic period, the rise of the Gnostics. And that takes us to the Demiurge. Let's talk about the Demiurge. Gnosticism is a name that we give to a very loose assortment of religious movements that come around in early Christianity, typically around the 1st century CE. There's not honestly all that much that connects them, but one thing that might connect them is the rough idea of the Demiurge. And by the way, I know I'm throwing a lot of terminology at you. Stick with me here. A lot of the Gnostic movements, especially the ones that Bookchin mentions, so movements like the Marcionites and the Ophites, they have a very clear separation between good and evil. The movements believe that there is a hidden and transcendental heavenly God, and then there is also a more material presence that creates the conditions in our physical reality. It creates the conditions of our physical world. For the Marcionites, this was literally the Old Testament God. They believed that the Old Testament God, because it was so out of tune with the New Testament God, with what Jesus was preaching, how could this Old Testament God be so violent and the New Testament God be so kind and giving, that the Old Testament God must be something entirely different. And so for the Marcionites, it was a demiurge, not a god truly, but a demiurge that constructed physical reality. And that's the Marcionites. That's not all of the Gnostics, but it's helpful, I think, to think through that idea. Anyway, the material presence is the demiurge. It lies behind the physical world, and it is deeply flawed. And if you want to get past this deeply flawed demiurge that's created your physical reality, you need to have this transcendental experience of knowledge. You need to gain spiritual knowledge, or gnosis. This is where we get the Gnostic word from. And what you need to know about gnosis is that it comes from the individual, and that means that transcendent goodness comes from the self. It doesn't come from anything else. Especially, it doesn't come from legalistic laws. Codes of law, that's a function of the demiurge. If you want to resist the demiurge, then guess what you also have to resist? The law. So when you look into a lot of these Gnostic movements, and again, we're painted with a very, very broad brush here, and anyone who knows more of this history than I do, which is basically everyone, will rightly point out that you can't really talk about the Gnostic movement in any meaningful sense, but a lot of the movements that people like Bookchin have highlighted, especially the Marcionites, they are preaching a radical kind of nonconformity, a nonconformity with basically everything. The Ophites are another really interesting offshoot of this. The Ophites actually, the Ophites from the serpent, the word for serpent, they are praising the serpent in Eden, which we often, modern day, tend to identify as the devil. But the Ophites say, actually, in the original Edenic story, the serpent is coming and offering knowledge. Eve deserves to be raised in our estimation because she's going out to seek knowledge, and the serpent is the giver of knowledge. And again, the serpent is opposed to the Old Testament God. The Old Testament God is not God, but the demiurge. I know this sounds crazy. I know this is a lot of words, but it kind of makes a lot of sense. So if you are an Ophite, a follower of the Ophites, you are thinking, oh, hang on. The true God that was revealed by Jesus is the one that I should be following. My spirit is connected to that. Through this transcendental experience of knowledge, I can gain a connection that is closer to Jesus. And to do that, I must resist what the demiurge God has built. And to do that, I need to resist what society and the law and the governor and the hierarchies are telling me. And by the way, there's also a distinction that Bookchin makes between various types of Gnostic movements. He says that some of these movements went towards kind of hedonism, just outright do whatever you like, and others went closer to asceticism, which is very, very based on sort of rigid forms of self-control, self-discipline. We will talk more about this a little bit at the end when we get to his final concept of freedom, but Bookchin basically, spoilers, lands on balance. Remember what I said right there in the intro lecture. Bookchin is really, really interested in the idea of balance. But either way, talking about these early Christians, you can see why somebody like Murray Bookchin is absolutely fascinated with these early Christian movements, because many of these can be considered precursors to anarchist movements. And by the way, if I can do a real quick plug here, okay, bear with me, but on that 100 Great Anarchist Thinkers project that I mentioned, we're actually talking about a bunch of these. We're talking about 2 in the English tradition. We're talking about Gerard Winstanley of the Diggers, and the very close and related movement of the Levelers, both of which happen in England. We also get into Jesus Christ and Thomas Müntzer, who's with the Anabaptists. The Anabaptists is another loose collection of deeply radical Christian movements. There is a lot in these early radical Christian movements that comes very close to our modern understanding of anarchism, which is why when I was building the series for how do you talk about kind of the proto-anarchists, I had to include a lot of these Christian movements and even take a video to talk about Jesus Christ and the influence that Jesus Christ's thought had on the rest of the world, even though it's not anarchism, but maybe a proto-anarchism. Anyway, let's get back to the main thing here, and let's talk about the Black Retribution, which is a fantastic phrase. Anyway, the Black Retribution. Hi everyone, it's me from the future. I realized as I went in to record this that I am saying Black Retribution instead of Black Redistribution. I don't know why that word got stuck in my head, but it is, of course, Black Redistribution. Black Retribution does sound awesome and metal as hell. However, it's not quite right, but it is the title of my next screenplay. So anyway, I didn't fix this episode just because it's not a huge deal. I'm not going to go in and re-record everything, but just so you know, Bookchin, when he talks about this, is talking about the Black Redistribution, not the Black Retribution. All the other stuff is the same. Thanks. Bookchin kind of frames these movements in context, in their historical context. So remember from the earlier videos that we've done, Bookchin thinks that in organic society, these organic societies start out having freedom that's based around the irreducible minimum. Bare minimum things that you are just assumed to have. If you are in an organic society, guess what? You have food, no matter what. You don't get food according to the however much you work. You just get it. The means of life is provided, and it's assumed that it will be provided, which is very, very important. So the irreducible minimum needs are met. As society starts to develop, this is what Bookchin says, we move further and further away from the irreducible minimum. But all of a sudden, you have powerful people who are gathering up concentrations of wealth and goods and apportioning them based on hierarchy. They're apportioning them to maintain their own power. And so you have these developing concentrations of power. And this is what Bookchin says leads to the Black Retribution. The Black Retribution is what happens when a society that maybe understood or had some concept of the irreducible minimum moved far enough away from the irreducible minimum to really want the irreducible minimum back. Then they would go and fight for it. The Black Retribution in practice looks like an absolute assault on the laws and rules of civilization and on concentrations of power. So you take stuff, you redistribute stuff, you burn stuff, and crucially, you burn records. You burn the rules of power. In other words, Bookchin refers to this kind of like upheaval, this movement, as kind of a libidinal urge. It is something that is deeply primal. It is kind of a deep-seated anger that's kind of inherent in this structure that's been built around you that you know can't hold. Something's not right and you need to get back to it. And so you go and you attack in this Black Retribution the locuses of power and the rules that are being given to you. And especially you attack the laws that Bookchin says interfere with this kind of Christian splinter group idea of freedom. You get, for example, the Crusade of the Shepherds, the Flagellants of Germany, the English Peasants Revolt. That's the English Peasants Revolt of 1381. That's the one we started this video with. You get the Taborites in 1419. Many of these movements were actually anarchistic. They were profoundly egalitarian sometimes, and often they were actually strangely feminist, and more often than not, they were incredibly violent. And this legacy of violence, by the way, is where we get a couple movements that are still with us today. They have their roots in this kind of early Christian communalism. A lot of them we think as very peace-loving, but they are really rooted in this legacy of violence. The early Quakers, for example, very much in the same tradition. But the early 1300s as well, we see the rise of a group called the Free Spirit thinkers. This is another loose agglomeration of a bunch of different people that hold that grace comes from the free Holy Spirit inhabiting the body. And from this, you get the Hussites, the Adamites that break off during the Hussite upheaval. You also get the Ranters that pop up during the English Revolution. The communalist spirit also comes back around during the Anabaptist movements, during the Reformation. That's all the Thomas Müntzer stuff that I referenced. It pops up with the Diggers, that's Jared Winstanley in the 1640s. And we still to this day live with many modern incarnations of this now. Now, if you have read your Frantz Fanon, the Wretched of the Earth, and I have a whole series on Frantz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth, by the way. If you want to check that out at some point, patreon.com/champagneanarchism. If you have read your Fanon, you know that Fanon actually says something similar when it comes to violence. He says that violence is inherently a movement towards liberation. It's an expression of liberation, of emancipation if you are an oppressed population. And an oppressed population can take action, and by that action, start to free itself from the kind of the psychic chains of domination. It's really interesting. And as you read Bookchin, think of potential parallels between this idea and what Fanon comes up with in the 1960s. Anyway, there's another concept that we do have to talk about, and that's something that Bookchin refers to as the hallucinogenic strategy. The hallucinogenic strategy is kind of what he refers to as a psychic battering ram. It's there to just bash our mental understanding of the rules and civilization's rules. For some movements, he's already said, it is hedonism. It's let's go out and engage in these bodily pleasures. Do what you want. It's kind of libertinism. You go out, hedonistically experience the world. For others, it's pretty psychotic. It's things like self-flagellation, right? The ascetic side of things. But in either case, it's a way to break the hold that these rules have over your brain, this kind of false world order. The power of the Demiurge, in other ways, to reuse that term. And Bookchin actually compares this to the drug use of the 1960s, right? Shock your brain with psychedelic drugs to learn that the rules and structures that we abide by are all kind of made up. There's actually a lot of connective tissue between those two ideas. This is a very powerful idea, but let's caution here, right? It is such a powerful idea that it's often used to create cult mentalities at the same time, right? Things that kind of separate you from the world. This all sort of plays into the hands of the powerful and can be used to create sort of the ultimate sort of hierarchical domination, sort of absolute domination, which is a cult. However, it is nonetheless very interesting to think of what a modern version of this would kind of look like. But let's go ahead and talk about the modern church here very quickly. Now, obviously, there is no one single modern church. There are the closest you have to sort of a single locus of power in modern Christianity is the Catholic Church, which is separate, which is all kind of concentrated, I should say, around the papacy, around the Pope and the Vatican. But even within Catholicism, I mean, there are a million different factions. And then when you get to the Protestants, there are another million different denominations. And then within those denominations, there are subdivisions within those denominations. It's very tough to talk about the modern church. But one thing that Bookchin did absolutely nail is this tendency, this kind of trend from the church towards proximity and towards accommodation of power. If you read this book and Murray Bookchin, and you want to figure out his thoughts on Christianity, you have to understand that it's double-edged. He says that this is something that had tremendous power, but it's also another structure that is used to rule. He told us this before, right? Back in chapter 6, that bit that I referenced. But there is still some power here, and it's important to kind of highlight that. So Bookchin, if you notice, if you read chapter 8, he has this very sneaky critique that he slides in there. Right? I think it's literally in the last 2 pages of chapter 8, where he talks about how the world has kind of been taken over by economics. And it's a critique of leftists who use economic language in their arguments. So because everything in society has become economized in one way or another, right? Takeover of capitalism. Because it's been economized, leftists, when they go out to argue and have these debates, and all this dates right back to Karl Marx, right? When we talk about class interests and the material substrate of society, we are using language given to us by economics. But Bookchin says, hang on, look at these Christian movements for a sec. Because our understanding of the world being economized, it's actually kind of helpful in certain ways, but in other ways, it's very useful to remember these early Christian notions when we talk about freedom, especially among leftists right now, because we're not really talking about economic relations in any meaningful sense. What we're actually talking about is humans. It's humanity. It's our ability to authentically live our lives as humans, and that is something that transcends economics, and that should be our goal. And so here, as we close chapter 8, let's get Bookchin's big, all-encompassing definition of freedom, right? We've been talking about freedom for 6, maybe even chapters now. And here's the definition. Bookchin says that freedom is the autonomous individual's freedom to shape material life in a form that is neither ascetic nor hedonistic, but a blend of the best in both. One that is rational, ecological, and artistic. And I actually love that definition. It's broad, it is very encompassing, but it kind of says a lot. What do you think? Let me know. Drop comments, head to the Patreon, drop me a line directly. I'm always happy to field those. Let me know what you think, as always. Thank you so much for watching this. Just a quick plug right at the end. Do check out that Patreon feed, patreon.com/champagneanarchism. I really, really have loved seeing all the comments and all the reactions. Some people are really digging this series, and that is fantastic. That's really awesome. Please let me know what else I can do, what else we should be talking about, all of this. Next week, we're going to be talking all about technology, because we're getting into chapters 9 and 10. And then one lecture after that, we're actually closing out this book. So if you've made it this far in the Ecology of Freedom, congratulations. We are on the home stretch now in this fantastic book. I genuinely hope that you have engaged and you are loving going through this book as much as I am. But either way, thank you very much. I will see you next time. Goodbye.